Okay, good morning. I'm Maureen Reedy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media, and it's truly my pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's program, The Truth About Diversity, Finding Your Discomfort Zone, How Brands and Media Can Be Allies for Real Inclusion. First, we'd like to extend our sincerest thanks to our partners at Mccann Worldwide and Truth Central, our partners in today's presentation and the event. We also thank the incredible panel of truly gifted individuals who have joined us here today to tackle these important issues that are not only confronting brands and the media, but every aspect of American life. How can the media and brands help create an inclusive environment in an age perhaps of unprecedented polarization when people are increasingly choosing to engage with viewpoints only that mirror their own? And to what extent are they even responsible for doing so? We will explore these kinds of questions today in several different conversations. First, with two key members of Mccann's Truth team, Laura Simpson and India Wooldridge, who will present the findings of their study. Then, following this presentation, will be a discussion with David Allen Greer, Angela Kang, Blair Underwood, Elizabeth Vargas, and Brandon Michael Hall, plus our moderator, Singleton Beato, the Chief Diversity and Engagement Officer for Mccann World Group. One quick housekeeping note, we encourage you all to take photos and you can share them on social media. We just ask, please, no photos or recording of anything that appears on screen. And we thank you in advance for your cooperation. Now I'm delighted to introduce Suzanne Powers, the Global Chief Strategy Officer for Mccann World Group. Suzanne is responsible for the strategic development of the company and its clients across all brands, regions, and agencies. This encompasses worldwide leadership of the strategic talent and resources that drive idea development for creative solutions across all platforms. Included in this is the Truth Central community, the global intelligence unit dedicated to discovering the macro-level truths that drive new opportunities for their brands. Under Suzanne's leadership, Mccann has been consistently recognized as the world's most creatively effective marketing communication company. Mccann was ranked #1 most creatively effective global network by the Effie in 2018 and 19, the Effie's Agency of the Year in 2017 and 18, and was named the #1 advertising agency network for creative effectiveness in the 2019 WARC Effective 100 rankings. And, I'm not done, in April of 2019, Suzanne was named 2019 Chief Strategy Officer of the Year by Ad Age magazine. I ask you all to join me in welcoming Suzanne to the stage.
All right, I busy myself whenever that is going on because it's very embarrassing. But thank you, everybody, for showing up this morning on a cloudy, rainy, all trains not working, mine included, New York morning, for our global launch for Truth About Diversity. This is obviously an incredibly important topic. It sparks a lot of debate. It sparks a lot of dissension, frankly. And because of that, we thought it was important to really go out and have a big dig into this, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And Laura and India will take you through all the details behind the work involved in this study. But the reason that we thought it was so critical is because in order to move forward, in order to really embrace diversity in all of its forms, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit as well, we need to have a fact-based conversation. And we need to understand what's really happening in the minds and lives, the attitudes, the behaviors of people all over the world. This study is global, and that's a very important piece, because one of the things you'll see is that when we take a broader lens into understanding diversity and all the different ways that we can actually understand it across the world, it opens up our minds. It allows us to embrace different perspectives, to acknowledge different attitudes about what diversity even means. And that helps us decide how we move forward and how we create a more diverse, and we're going to talk about this today, more inclusive environment for ourselves, but also for the brands that we get the honor to partner with, and frankly, for society and the world at large, if we dare say that with this research. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Laura and India to come on up to the stage. Laura and India really do all of the work when it comes to identifying these macro-level truths that Truth Central uncovers. And that's incredibly important work in the case of this particular study, but all of the studies that we do. So they'll be taking you through our findings, then we'll do our panel, as we discussed before, and then I'll come back and kind of synthesize a little bit of the key themes for you so that you can all walk out of the room today armed with, again, that fact-based understanding of what the real truth about diversity is. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. So before we dive into the findings, I just want to give you a little bit of information on the background to the research itself. So first of all, we have the quantitative research. It's a survey conducted online in all of the markets that you see here on the map. So we have a sample of over 30,000 people globally, so a robust piece of data. And then from a qualitative point of view, there were two sides to the qualitative research. We did focus group discussions with people who self-defined as a minority. We also had one-on-one phone interviews with people who described themselves as diversity skeptics. So we're really trying to get a spectrum of views when it comes to how people think and feel about diversity. And the qualitative markets are all on the map here, so you can see what representation we have there as well. So one of the most important things we wanted to say right at the outset of this research is, from our point of view, even though all of our studies are called Truth About, this is really for us about conversations rather than answers. I think the thing about diversity is it's such an expansive topic and it's so multi-layered that we can't stand here and say that we have all of the answers. And I think, one of the best things for us is every time we present this, people have tons of questions. There are people who come up and say, actually, I have a different interpretation of that data point. So we really welcome any thoughts and contributions you have so we can keep on moving this conversation forward. And, in the words of one of our Serbian respondents, actually the worst thing is when there are no questions, because we genuinely do want to keep adding to this piece of research. So in terms of the topics we're going to be focused on today, we have 4 chapters. The first one is Diversity Runs Deep, where we're really going to be looking at the globality of the diversity conversation. As Suzanne said, we're going to be digging into some of the differences between countries and their attitudes to diversity. In the second chapter, we're going to explore the differences between what you might call the theory of diversity, so how people say they feel about this topic, and then what they really do, and the gap between those two things. In the third chapter, we're going to focus a little bit more on the individual and look at the sort of complexity of how people think about their individual identities. And then finally, in the fourth chapter, we're going to bring it back and talk about brands and advertising and marketing and how brands are responding to this new environment. So anyone who's seen a Truth Central presentation before may know that we like to sort of ask quiz questions as we go through the presentation, just to sort of warn you up front. But here's one of the questions that we asked in the research itself. So we actually asked this of respondents. We said, on an average day, would you rather people saw you as masculine or feminine? So maybe everyone here can just think about what your answer to that question would be, and I'll show you what the data looks like globally. So this is really interesting, right? So a quarter of people globally say that they would like to be seen as both equally masculine and feminine. And also, very interestingly, 44% of people globally chose feminine, which is really interesting because that means not only were a lot of women choosing feminine, but a lot of men were choosing feminine as well. And I think given the global movement that we've seen towards gender empowerment, we're seeing this democratization of femininity. Okay, so I have another quiz question for you. This time I am going to get you to vote. So who do you think is more likely to agree that diversity is overrated? So hands up if you think that's minority groups. Anyone in the room? Non-minority groups, hands up. Okay, well, you're going to find this very surprising. It is, in fact, minority groups. So really, really interesting. So we dug into this in the qualitative research, and I think our perception of this is the frustration that minority groups feel is that there's been a ton of conversation about diversity and inclusion, but not enough action. So I think that's where they see this as an overrated conversation rather than an overrated issue. Okay, so diving into our first chapter, Diversity Runs Deep. What I'd like to do to kick off this chapter is actually play for you a film that we created and another piece of research that we did called The Truth About Global Brands. And as part of that research, we asked all of Mccann World Group's employees around the world to go out on the streets for one day and ask people questions about their lives. And one of the questions that they asked people is, what do you love about where you live? What do you love about your city? And I just want to play a film that will bring to life some of those quotations.
I love the diversity of the city. It offers lots of possibilities for everyone. And it's also a safe place with many different cultures.
It's an international community. It's like we have the UN right here in our neighborhood.
The best thing is the stylistic diversity between neighborhoods, the contrasts, the cultures, and the various struggles that seek to be vindicated.
Our city is multicultural. There are people from every religion.
It's a city full of life, and the streets are extremely vivid. There's a lot of chaos as well, but it's beautiful.
The city I belong to is very colorful, versatile, exuberant, and full of energy.
We're kind to each other and we look out for each other. People come from different backgrounds and cultures. We can accommodate and tolerate each other.
There is only one race, the human race.
Okay, so I guess one of the things we observed as we look at all of the sort of qualitative data that we got back from this exercise is that for a lot of people, diversity is pretty much part of the fabric of their everyday lives, particularly people who live in urban environments. So in many ways, it's a new normal. But of course, just because it's a new normal, that doesn't mean that it's straightforward. Because one of the other things we learned is that depending on which country you were in, you have a very different interpretation of what the word diversity actually means. So more quiz questions. So the first quiz here is, what do people in the US first associate with diversity? So when they hear the word diversity, what is their top of mind association? So let me go through this list and you can raise your hand for what you think the answer is. Let's try it. Some people hopefully will get this one right this time. But okay, so hands up if you think it's race. Okay, it's pretty strong vote for the first one. Gender. Few people age. Few people finally income. Okay. Yay! Well done. Well done to the audience. So yes, absolutely, race, the top of mind association here in the US when it comes to diversity. Let's contrast that to a very different market. So when we ask the same question in China, what do you think the answer is? So again, let's go through the list. Hands up if you think it's race, gender, age, income. Audience was kind of split, but I think quite a few people did get that right, which in fact it is income. But let me just give you a sense of how this plays out globally, because as you can see, depending on where you are in the world, again, people have very different top-of-mind associations with what diversity means. So let me take you on a quick whistle-stop tour of the globe. If we look in Brazil, so it's LGBTQ. Interestingly, there have been some recent legislation changes in Brazil. So it's now illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their gender identity or being LGBTQ. So that's obviously a top-of-mind issue for people. If we look at India, it's religion. India is the birthplace of several major religions and has a sort of rich history of religious diversity. So again, unsurprising that that's an association in that part of the world. And then finally, Japan. Interestingly, lots of people from rural areas in Japan are moving en masse to urban areas, putting pressure on those rural economies. So again, a very top of mind issue for people in Japan. So I think, there could be hundreds of things on the list that I have here. But again, one of the things that we came to understand from looking at the data is there are so many different facets when it comes to understanding what diversity is. Everything from balance of political perspectives through to religion, through to historical origins, just so many different things to consider when we look at the complexity of what diversity means around the world. But I think another interesting thing to consider in the diversity conversation is we can take a category like gender, which once upon a time people would have assumed is a relatively simplistic or straightforward categorization. And even that now has a huge amount of complexity or fluidity. So on Facebook, for example, if you choose the custom gender dropdown, you actually have more than 50 different ways that you can define your individual gender, which I think speaks to that tremendous fluidity that we now see in that component of the diversity conversation. And through the lens of our data, we can also see this reflected, particularly among younger audiences. So 64% of 18 to 34-year-olds around the world now believe that gender is a fluid concept. And interestingly, even a significant proportion of that younger age group would consider changing their gender or certainly being more open to the way that they define their gender. So very, very interesting data. So I think despite the fact that we see all of these sort of very important local nuances, what we can also do is take a step back and try and see if there are any patterns at a macro level that we can see in the global data. And I think there are some quite interesting data points here, because if we take a market like the UK and the US, for example, we can see quite a lot of similarities. So around about 60% of people saying they support diversity initiatives, around about half of people believe that gender is a fluid concept, over half of people believe that it's socially acceptable for men to wear makeup, for example. More people in the UK than there are here in the US believing that. But then let's contrast that to India and China on the right-hand side of this chart. And you can see that there are significantly higher levels of agreement for all three of those statements, which I think is kind of interesting, because often when we talk about diversity, I think there's this sense that ideas are being exported from the West to other countries around the world. And certainly when this big news story broke in India about the fact that gay sex was being legalized, some of the conversation was around that, right? Okay, so India's now more in line with countries that we see in Europe. Whereas interestingly, some scholars in India, some historians were saying, well, actually, if you go back to the roots of culture in India before colonialization, you see more fluidity around gender, more openness around homosexuality. So actually, this is not a new idea. This is going back to the roots of Indian culture. So it's kind of like an interesting thing for us to consider as we were looking at the global data, that actually progress is not a Western export, and we always need to understand the individual stories in all the countries that we're looking at. But just to keep talking about India for a minute, I mean, obviously, as we can look to progress in one area of what's happening in India, we only need to look at another side of society, specifically attitudes towards women, and we see a very different picture. Some of you may know that India is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. And I wonder if any of you saw this news story earlier this year. There was a legislation change in India that allowed women to enter temples where previously they'd been excluded. So even though the Supreme Court changed that piece of legislation, women were still prevented from entering those temples. So 5 million women in Kerala came out and formed a wall of women, one of the biggest single protests ever in India, to defend the right of those women to enter temples. So again, we need to understand the complexity of the diversity conversation within individual countries. And to do that, we need to look at the zeitgeist, we need to look at what's happening now, specific examples, but we also need to look at the deep cultural roots of any society and country to understand what those deeper drivers of the conversation are. So in terms of implications for brands, I think there's two big things here. The first one is, how can we learn from other countries in terms of how they're approaching diversity, the problems that they're facing, and how they're trying to solve them? And then secondly, if you're a global brand, if you're creating a global piece of culture or a show, how can you represent diversity in a culturally nuanced way for each country?
Thanks. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about some of the tensions and contradictions that we see around this topic and the principles versus the reality. to get a sense of how people view diversity at a really broad level. We asked these pretty high level questions. So if you wanted to build a strong society, solve a problem, or come up with a creative idea, who would you rather bring together? Would you rather people that look the same and think the same? Or would you rather people that look different and think differently? And we saw some pretty revealing results because at principle, people absolutely value diversity. You can see here, 59% of people believing their society would be stronger if it was comprised of people who think and look differently. If we look that next question to solving a problem, you see diversity is even more valued with 65% of people agreeing. And if we come even closer to home, for us as marketeers and brands, coming up with a creative idea, diversity is absolutely celebrated. However, despite people acknowledging that in principle diversity is absolutely important, the more and more we dug into the analysis, we saw that there was a gulf between the principles and the reality. And in fact, I want to hark back to that piece of research that Laura mentioned earlier, where we sent 20,000 Mccann World Group employees onto the streets to understand what was going on in their local neighbourhood. And we heard some of the reality of the situation come to the fore. So let me just play this video.
The influx of people from other parts of the country and other parts of the world has influenced the vibe negatively. You can't trust anyone totally.
I used to love starting random conversations with people, but now I spend a whole day not talking to anyone anymore.
Many people are here today, but not tomorrow.
Terrorist attacks are very likely to happen, and you cannot take the metro or go to a concert without having a little fear or second thought. It's a scary part of our lives today.
There are those who feel like if you're not on their side, then you're the enemy.
There are more people living in less space, and resources have remained the same. It's more crowded, and at times people seem more frustrated.
The city is getting tougher and more cruel. People are more suspicious and worried.
So again, when we went to set up the Truth About Diversity, we really wanted to dig into some of these tensions and ask questions that directly leaned into it. And you can see here the answers are incredibly revealing. So despite people acknowledging diversity, you can see here that 57% of people globally believe their country was better when there was less immigration. Next, 53% of people say, I feel minority groups or minority groups different to that of my own are getting all of the opportunities and I'm getting left behind. And 43% saying, I feel uncomfortable around people who are different from me. So despite thinking it's better that we have all these differences, people acknowledging the reality is there's a level of discomfort there. And what really fascinated us was when we cut this by younger generations, because I think often when people see stats like this, it's assumed that they're going to get less important as generations phase out. Younger generations are much more open, and as we saw Laura showed us, open to gender fluidity, open to different ways of thinking about diversity. But for me, what surprised me here is actually they're just as likely to feel some of these macro-societal tensions as well. These issues aren't going away. So in order for us to truly understand what's at the heart of some of these contradictions, we wanted to really get under the skin of how people are feeling about the topic and understand the nuanced ways in terms of how they're viewing it. And for us, the best way to do that was to work with a statistician to take those 30,000 respondents you saw and create a really detailed segmentation, which I want to share with you here today, which will hopefully give you a bit of an idea of some of the nuances we're seeing. So I'm actually going to start in the middle because that's where we see a lot of those shades of grey. And across the board, these three groups do agree in principle that diversity is really important. But you'll see here we've put yes, but. Because often it's, yes, I really agree with diversity, but it's followed up with something which is a fear that comes to the fore. So starting with protectionist purists, 17% of the global population. Yes, I agree with diversity, but not necessarily in my backyard. And you see these people in the data, they really want to protect cultures that they feel are under threat. And when we spoke to them in our groups, they said, yes, but not perhaps at my child's kindergarten. Yes, but actually when I've seen it come to life in my neighborhood, it's made me a little worried. These people very much protecting what they know. Next up, we have the biggest group globally, 41%. And these people very much are for diversity, but they're a little reticent to get involved. They're not quite sure how to engage. They see it as important, but they're not very vocal about it. They're certainly not attending marches or protests, and perhaps they see it as not necessarily being their fight. Next up, we have the cultural conformists, 11% of people globally. Now, these people are quite distinct because actually they say that society is more better if it's comprised of people who look the same and think the same. But that's not because they're against diversity. It's actually because they're much more likely to come from markets which are much more homogenous in the way they're comprised. So we see a lot of over-index in Asia here. They are very pro-diversity in other elements, really open-minded and progressive around certain indicators. But for them, perhaps they see it as not being a problem here. If we go to the outer edges of the segmentation, I'm sure you guys recognize these people. Diversity deniers, 8% globally, do not see the value of diversity, feel very threatened by it, and certainly don't see many upsides. On the other end of the spectrum, we see 16% of the woke warriors. These people are passionately for diversity and inclusion, passionately vocal about it on social media, absolutely attending marches and being very involved. Now, for me, where it gets super interesting, as a super nerd, is when we start to cut the segmentation by different markets and you see how it plays out. And I'm just going to give you a flavor of this to show you. So let's look at China. Again, you know, I called out cultural conformists. You can see here the over-index, 35% massively being comprised of their society. Much less on the polar opposites for them. If we compare that with here in the US, for me, it's fascinating. Those polar opposites, the diversity deniers and woke warriors, far higher in this market. And you really feel the tensions flare as a result of that. It's interesting to me also that both countries have exactly the same sideline sitters, but how it plays out in the individual cultures is very different. Now, as Laura mentioned, one of the things that we really wanted to do as a part of this research is lean into those polar opposites because we hear so much about them in the press. But we didn't want to do that to create greater polarization, absolutely not. We wanted to understand the nuanced ways and different ways they're approaching the same topics. So here you can see some quotes that illustrate that. So we spoke to a woke warrior in Chile. Diversity makes the visible invisible. The diversity denier here, but don't expect society to turn upside down for you. You see some of the tensions flaring around the same topic. Here we have a woke warrior saying our future is heading in the right direction. But you can see someone in Serbia from the other end saying, we don't have time to do this. We're preoccupied with our own lives. The last one, you know, people in South Africa, woke warrior saying, you know, the blending together of cultures is amazing. In Peru, we see the upside of that. Our city is collapsing because of it. So you see the way in which people are approaching different topics. But the way I was really intrigued to speak to people about these topics was to find that common ground. And what's so fascinating about that segmentation I showed you is when we look at some of the indicators for woke warriors, for diversity deniers, they're actually exactly the same. There's so many elements they agree on. They believe that society should be more compassionate. They believe that society should have greater empathy. They're really passionate about what they believe in, and they care about it so much. And in fact, when we spoke to people in our groups, we saw that come through. The common ground is there. You know, different people, I haven't clicked, sorry. Instead of confronting people, we should help them to understand, and that is the answer. And on the other side, the most important part is treating other people respectfully, even though we have differences. They both are looking for that olive branch. They both are looking for discussion. And I think this is, for me, absolutely critical, because if we don't engage, then people forget that there are actual human beings the other side of the conversation, actual people, and that humanity is stripped from the conversation. And in fact, you know, if we forget there are real people, we forget that I think many of us are approaching diversity in a very human way. And we saw that in the data, that people are acknowledging that they're not having sanitized responses to this. They are behaving like humans. They're making mistakes. We see that 74% of people say, I try not to judge others on the basis of their race, gender, or age, but sometimes I think I do. And it's important that we acknowledge these mistakes, because for me, that is the key to ensuring we don't get to a place of diversity deadlock, a place where we don't feel that we can talk to others. It's a tricksy little thing. It's double clicking. 54% of people saying, I don't feel comfortable sharing my opinions with others because I fear I will offend someone. You know, how can we have progress if we can't even speak to someone? And I think this is so important to understand. Of course, you know, how we really share the stories and allow people to be open and honest is critical, especially for us as brands and marketers, because it allows us to show a really human face to this discussion. Before I give you a brand example, I actually want to share a wonderful example that Laura found in Copenhagen. I do believe they have chapters all around the world in 70 other countries. But it's called the Human Library, which I think is such a wonderful idea, bringing to life the elements we've talked about. The Human Library is a place where you can go in and speak to a human book. Now, a human book is an actual person who has said, I identify as having experience in this element. So if you want to go and speak to and get the perspective of someone with ADHD, alcoholic, it's all organised alphabetically, you can see, they have a whole raft of different people. You can go and book time with them and actually learn and understand what it's like to be in their shoes, which I think is such a powerful way of helping bridge some of those tensions we've seen. Now, in terms of the implications for brands, I think for me one of the best learnings is how do we reflect how nuanced people are thinking about this discussion. It's really not the polar opposites, which we're seeing being heightened in the media. Actually, there are so many shades of grey in between. And then secondly, of course, how can we look to inject humanity back into the conversation? And I think a brand which does this so beautifully, which I want to share with you, is Microsoft. I'm going to play the ad first, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
My name is Grover.
Sean. My name is Ian.
I'm Taylor. My name is Owen, and I am 9.5 years old.
So Owen was born with a rare genetic disorder called Escobar syndrome.
He's had 33 surgeries to date.
I love video games, my friends, my family, and again video games.
It's his way of interacting with his friends when he can't physically otherwise do it.
What I like about the adaptive controller is now everyone can play. You can just say, all right, that's that button, that's that button, that's that button. Perfect.
One of the biggest fears early on is, how will Owen be viewed by the other kids? He's not different when he plays.
No matter how your body is or how fast you are, you can play. It's a really good thing to have in this world.
And this is such a beautiful example, not only because it's showing a diverse audience, but actually you don't necessarily, I think the assumption is that if you did a niche product for a smaller audience, like an adaptive controller, it would only target that audience. But this piece was one of the most lauded and loved commercials throughout the whole of the Super Bowl because it had that human story. You couldn't help but root for Owen and his family within this. So I think, showing diverse and inclusive stories absolutely gives you a sort of entry point into a much wider audience than perhaps you'd have otherwise.
Oh, thank you. I have to warn you, there's a few ads in here that make me feel quite emotional. So if I become tearful at any point, it's probably a combination of jet lag and the fact that, yes, there are some beautiful pieces of work. So I want to talk about identity and the individual and sort of get a little bit deeper into that topic. So sort of building on some of the themes that we set up in chapter 1. But before we do that, I just have another couple of quiz questions that I want to ask you. So one of the questions we ask people is, what do people believe is the most important trait for a man to have today? Okay, so I'm going to read out these responses and you can vote again. So we have confident, honest, strong, and supportive. So who thinks the answer is confident? Okay, a few people. Honest. Okay, a few more. Strong. Few, and then finally supportive. Okay, it looks like it's a tie between honest and supportive. The answer is in fact honest. But once again, what I can show you that I think is kind of interesting is we can look at over-indexes in individual markets. So honest was rated very highly across countries, but we can see which answers actually pop in specific markets. So you can see how different it is here in the US and also in the UK, supportive coming to the top. But we also have what else can we see here? I like action-oriented in Germany, for example. So again, you're seeing some interesting nuances at a local level. So let's do the same exercise for women. What do people believe is the most important trait for a woman to have today? Okay, so who thinks it's caring, intelligent, honest, independent? Interesting. So independent by far the top answer there. Globally, I can tell you it's actually intelligent as the number one. But again, you can see, once again, there are sort of nuances that we can pull out in individual markets. But I can tell you that if we ask women, what is the number one trait a woman should have today? Spoiler, I'm just going to show you because you all guessed this, but it is in fact independent. And again, I think that goes back to this conversation we're having about female empowerment around the world, right? And the fact that people are recognizing how important it is for women to have that feeling of independence, particularly economic independence, I think. So, a whole rich conversation behind that data point. Okay, but just before we dive into the rest of the data, I want to ask everyone in the audience a question, which is if you had to come up with some words or phrases that sort of most define who you are as an individual. Let's say you had to pick 3 words or descriptors. What 3 words would you choose? I'm not going to pick on individuals, but just think in your own head. If I had to choose 3 words, what 3 words would I choose? Okay, I did this exercise myself, and the 3 I came up with for myself were mother, data enthusiast, and then finally hypochondriac, or possibly cyberchondriac, because I spend a lot of time diagnosing illnesses online. But anyway, I'm interested to know who here had a kind of family descriptor, so something to do with your family role. Anyone here? Who had like a demographic descriptor in general, so something to do with your age, your gender, your geography? Few people. Who chose a word that's more to do with their personality, so how they are? That's everybody. That's everybody. And I think that's really interesting because that's actually one of the things that we found in the groups that we did. We actually asked our respondents to visualize their identity for us. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So this is from Guatemala. So a guy talking about his love of football, but also a lot of his personality attributes. This was my personal favourite. It was from one of our respondents in the UK. She said the words at the top most defined who she was. So we'd actually recruited her for our minority groups on the basis of being LGBTQ and also non-binary. But the 3 words she had at the top were artist, British, Turkish. Then you get into only child. You're also going to see country bumpkin in there, which is a sort of British way of describing being from a rural area. Traveller. So you start to get a sense of just how rich people's identities are. But I think one of the other things we realised is if you represent a minority group, that's often how other people like to group you or find it very easy to group you and also want to talk to you about the fact that you are part of that minority group. What is it like being different? Tell me about being different. And on the one hand, people are like, do you know what? I love the curiosity. What I don't like is I have to have the same conversation all the time with everybody, and it kind of wears you down. And we saw that all around the world. So whether that's people saying, I find myself being grouped again and again, and I just want to be left alone. Whether it's someone saying, Miss Trixie, I just don't have the energy to go into it, so I'm really just whizzing you around the globe now with this clicker. I want diversity to be something natural. By the way, in the UK, we did a piece of research specifically with LGBTQ individuals, and one of the things we found most fascinating is when we look in sort of pop culture, often this moment of coming out is represented as a sort of one-time thing. You come out and then everything is different on the other side. Whereas a lot of those individuals were saying, you have to come out all the time. It's not a one-time thing. You have to come out with different people in different situations and make the choice. Do I want to or do I not want to? So again, I think the dynamism of some of those elements around identity is really interesting. And then I just wanted to put a quote in here at the end from Dominique Cran, one of the Michelin-starred chefs here in America. And I love this quote. She said, my male colleagues are asked, what is it like being a chef, not a male chef? And I long to be able to answer as they do. And again, I think that's really interesting because when you represent difference in a category, particularly in a field that's traditionally been dominated by men and you're the only woman, you have to talk about that a lot. One of the other interesting things we did was we said to our respondents, send us photographs of when you feel like you can be the truest version of yourself. And we noticed a couple of interesting patterns. One is that we got tons of photographs of people like on vacation or at festivals, right? This idea that I have to be away from my everyday life in order to truly be myself. Another pattern that we noticed was that we actually got lots of pictures of people on their own at home. And kind of a heartbreaking quote from India, alone when I'm sleeping at night because there's no fear of being judged, right? It's this idea of I can only kind of authentically be myself when I'm not around other people. And I think we got the sense that for many, our full identities are still hidden from public view, right? Or certain aspects of our full identities are hidden from public view. And some of those elements we found kind of interesting or surprising. So just to give you a glimpse in some of the things we heard in the group, someone said, I hide that I'm a cancer survivor because I don't want people to think that I'm weak at work. We came across a guy who said, I think people think that men are supposed to have dogs because dogs are masculine pets. So I don't tell people that I have a cat. And I thought, just so interesting, right? The things that we feel we can't tell people about ourselves. And there were stories that made me sad as well. So we had a respondent who said, every day my dad made me a packed lunch, which I took to school, but I never ate it because my food looked and smelled so different from everybody else's that I didn't want people to realize that I was different, so I was always hungry. And I thought, wow, that's really the pain of exclusion, right? That's what it means to be different and not included in a particular environment. And this is really relevant at work as well, because 60% of people in our survey said, I sometimes feel like I have to put on a different persona to fit in at work. To some extent, you might be thinking, well, work's a professional environment, and maybe we all have to sort of dial up certain aspects of our personality or, who we are in order to fit in. But I think it's really worrying when you look at the fact that for LGBTQ individuals, this is quite a lot higher. For anyone who identifies as a minority, this is higher. And then if you are someone who has some kind of physical impairment or disability, this is significantly higher, right? So we have tons of people who are not showing up as their authentic selves at work. We call this the unvirtuous circle, because of course, if people don't feel comfortable at work, then they're spending way too much energy covering rather than focusing on the thing that they're being paid to do. Obviously, covering comes at the cost of innovation and new voices. Those individuals don't get to progress within the workplace because their voice is not being heard. And then eventually those people will leave and the dominant conversation gets reinforced. So we have this cycle which is really, really hard to break. But it's really, really important that we break it because this is how we unlock innovation and creativity in the brands and businesses that we work for. And as you can see in this data point, the vast majority of people around the world, 73%, believe that their workplace would be more successful if there was greater diversity, particularly intellectual diversity, which is one of the things that pops in the survey. So in terms of implications for brands, how can we recognize and reflect all these multi-layers that people have within their identities? And how can we find ways of counteracting the pain of exclusion with the joy of inclusion? And there's a piece of work that I just want to play for you now from MasterCard, which I think does a fabulous job of tapping into this idea, the joy of inclusion.
Handing over my card makes me feel very anxious and nervous.
Just a total invalidation of my identity. I tried not to focus on that because it happens so often.
I used to have moments of anxiety and moments of panic.
It puts me in a place where I feel like I'm in danger.
It just sucks every single time.
They look at it and they look at you, and they look at it and they look at you.
Oh, is this actually you?
Are you serious? Oh my God.
Stop.
That's so cool.
That's incredible. That's who I am. That's who I actually am.
Another one that might bring a little tear for me.
I'm going to present now. All right, that's a perfect example to lead us into this next section, inclusive brands. Your last quiz question. So, what do people believe has the greater ability to bring the world together by eliminating prejudices and stereotypes? Hands up if you think it's brands. Hands up if you think it's governments. It is, of course, brands. And brands are seen as the piece of work we were referring to earlier, The Truth About Global Brands. It showed us that brands have permission to play an incredibly rich and human role in the lives of people. And in fact, nowhere more so than here, because 73% of people globally believe that brands have a responsibility to promote diversity. And you can see that slightly higher in Thailand, but also higher with those who identify as being a minority in our group. But how brands engage is obviously under great scrutiny, and there are some that are doing it better than others. We've got a spectrum here. I'm not going to spend too much time on counterproductive. I'm not going to name and shame, but I think there are obviously quite a few fashion brands which have come into this realm in the past year. I would say the one thing they probably have in common is actually Laura talked about the importance of a diverse workplace. And if you had a diverse team working on many of the examples that I have in my head, I'm sure there would have been one person who would have been like, "Ooh, that doesn't seem like quite so a good idea." So ensuring that you have diverse teams looking at it can often make sure that you're not in this bottom category. Moving up, I want to speak to you a bit about lacking awareness, and especially where we're seeing brands are omitting certain groups of people. We've seen this especially coming to the fore, I think, in beauty brands. In fact, my own experience, last week I heard about this wondrous concealer, went to have a look at it, and I was very surprised to see find your perfect shade amongst 6 shades. Because the reality in 2019 is this is my expectation. I want to see a range of shades, and I want to see a range of undertones, and I want to see everybody reflected. So, obviously lacking awareness, if it's a genuine mistake and you correct it, moving forwards, higher up the scale is good, but you want to be really making sure that you're including everybody that exists within your category. Next up, we've called it ticking boxes, but I think this is really about when people are talking about diversity. And it can be a good thing, but there's a line that I want to talk to you about. And this is something that came up in our research again and again, especially when it came to the recent events of Pride, the 50th anniversary of Stonewall riots. And I'm not saying all of these brands did something around this area and it wasn't liked. Actually, there's a mixed bag. And some of the brands were really liked because they talked about it, they had a reason to be there, and they actually then followed it up with some really meaningful actions. But what we saw as a cautionary tale in a lot of our groups is this idea of woke washing. We had rainbow washing as well. If you're a brand and you engage in something and you jump on the bandwagon, as it seemed, we had that phrase from consumers, if you don't have a reason to be there, if you're not there for a meaningful purpose, often that is seen as being skeptical. So it's a fine line here, but it's a good starting point to start talking about diversity as a platform to moving up the scale. And the next element I want to speak to you about is reflecting reality, when you're really showing and being diverse as a part of all of your efforts. And actually, before I get into some of the positives here, we have a long way to go when it comes to representation. This is something that we've been tracking for a while when we look at how family life, women, men, we've got various other questions in this same idea. In terms of how they're reflected in the media, you see there is a sense that it is still outdated. And obviously, we're going to get into how the media portrays diversity and inclusion in a really in-depth way in the panel. But I think while there's some good positive steps in the right direction, we do have a long way to go as an industry. But I would say we've seen some really and heard some really wonderful examples in our research and as a part of this analysis. Laura mentioned the counterpoint to the pain of exclusion is often the joy of inclusion, when you recognize yourself in that moment, when you see yourself portrayed. And we heard so many of these examples. I want to share a few of them actually in one particular space. We've heard a lot around the movements happening for those who have physical impairments. And I want to show you a few examples around the world we've seen to bring this to life. So first up is Visibility 93, which is a project actually done by some colleagues of ours in London, where they realised that actually there are 93 ways that someone can identify as having an impairment, but there's only one icon that represents them all. So they've taken it under themselves to create icons for every single one of those 93 elements you can have an impairment, so that people feel truly represented when they want to discuss or select and see themselves on being represented properly. Next up, when we were writing this piece of research, this story went really viral, with especially this tweet, where someone says, "I know it shouldn't be exciting, but this is the first time I've ever seen disability portrayed in a shop window." People, Laura said she saw on the news, people were taking pilgrimages to this store because they were so excited to see a wedding store had represented disability in a new and interesting way, in a beautiful way, quite frankly. And even when we are in groups, we heard this quote, someone talking about Rihanna and the work that she had done, especially within her Savage Fenty line, saying, "I realized this was the first time I'd seen someone in lingerie with a prosthetic leg. And it was amazing. Like, I'd never seen it before. It was brilliant." So this idea of the joy of inclusion was heard time and time again. And of course, while it's incredibly rich and important for us to do, there's a real reason that comes through in the data as well, with 68% of people saying be prepared to pay more for a brand or product if they knew it was supporting something that they cared about. You can see this over-indexing in both China and India and mass affluent audiences as well. So this is a real expectation that people have. And actually, we've seen real results with our own brands. I want to share with you, L'Oreal partnered with Vogue last year to have the non-age issue. Last time we were here at the Paley Centre, we gave the talk around truth about age. And this is actually one of the insights that came out, where they realized people wanted to see much greater diversity within age, within fashion and style. This issue came out last year and actually sold and got better coverage than the September issue. Such was the demand for such a new perspective and new lens on this topic. So it can lead to really rewarding results. And then last up, I want to talk to you about how diversity inclusion, if it's truly lived and breathed within your company, it can be a force for innovation. And actually, I want to share with you again the stat that I gave earlier in this presentation around coming up with a creative idea, people valuing diversity. Because for me, this is the perfect segue into a really wonderful idea and an experience we had within Mccann, Israel. This is a creative, Eldar, and I'm going to let Eldar introduce himself in the video, but Eldar works on a little-known brand called IKEA, and here is the value that his perspective brought to unlocking a whole new way of thinking about their brand.
Hi, I'm Eldar, 32 years old. Although I have cerebral palsy, I do everything I can to conduct myself like everyone else. But in my own home, of all places, I'm surrounded with furniture crying out, "Cripple." I'd like to sit on a regular sofa, without being afraid I won't be able to get up, to open a regular closet, or even to turn on a regular lamp.
1 in every 10 people in Israel is a disabled person. The IKEA design vision gave birth to the Disables Project. Smart hacks making IKEA's best-selling items accessible. The project was created in collaboration with 2 NGOs, Milbot and Access Israel, and started off in the IKEA store with a hackathon of product engineers and disabled people that enabled better understanding of their needs. In the end of the developing process, 13 new products were born, each solving a different accessibility issue, such as sofa elevating legs for easier ascending, lamp button enlargement, special handles for PAX closets, and more. The new products are presented in the world's first accessible living spaces in the IKEA stores. The new models are available for download from the project's website, disables.com, and 3D printing anywhere in the world. So that Eldar, Dina, Pavel, Inbal, Moshe, Tahel, and Liel can also feel comfortable in their own homes like everybody else.
With products that assemble themselves.
And not only is this obviously a phenomenal game-changing idea, but I think for me it resonates so much more powerfully because it is so aligned with how and why IKEA exists. If you work with us at Mccann World Group, to have a meaningful role is the center of gravity for everything. And actually IKEA's meaningful role is really around how they can make design democratic for everybody, how it can be accessible to everybody. And for me, when they looked at this lens, with Eldar, his perspective, it ensured that it truly now is accessible for everyone, and it truly stands up to that meaningful role and promise that they seek to deliver upon. And obviously, if brands do this well, if they're able to truly live up to that promise that we've seen throughout the course of this presentation, then actually people are incredibly receptive. Our research within global brands shows that 81% believe that global brands have the power to make the world better. And I think when it comes to diversity and inclusion, there is so much they can do to help push and create progress. So today we've given you a whistle-stop tour amongst a very deep piece of research. We've talked about the diversity of diversity and how nuanced it is depending on the culture and country you grew up in. We've talked about some of the complexity and contradictions that exist, the principles versus the reality. Laura talked to you about identity and how multifaceted it is and how we should really think about all elements of it, especially in the workplace. And lastly, I've just given you a framework to talk about inclusive brands and how you can really use diversity as a springboard for innovation. So that's the end of the presentation. We're actually going to take a 5-minute break ahead of the panel. So I think we have some coffees outside if you'd like to come back in 5 minutes. Thank you very much for your time so far.
Okay, so thanks everybody. We're moving into our panel discussions. Very, very exciting. We want to make sure that we're very efficient with time because hopefully we'll have time for a couple questions from the audience. So with that, I would like to just ask the entire panel to come up. Hi. Come up. Oh, beautiful. So some of you may be familiar with these folks. But what we're going to do is we're going to mix it up a little bit because I think, we need to introduce you and talk about all of your amazing accolades in brief. But then, some of the things that we talked about in the study had to do with the way in which we identify ourselves. Because the beauty, one of the fabulous things about this study is that it really talks about the expansion of the way in which we need to think about diversity, right, beyond the silos. So we're going to start with you, David Allen Greer. So as most of you know, David Allen Greer is an incredible actor. He has graced the stage. Also, he has been on the big screen in movies. I think that many of us remember some of his incredible work on In Living Color. A true thespian, he studied Shakespeare at Yale. And he has done an amazing job at bringing incredible characters to life. Award nominee, he's worked on award-winning television shows and the like. You can Google him. But I would like to hand it first to you. Talk a little bit about, how do you identify yourself? If you had to just, name 3 things, what?
All right, how do I define myself professionally? I was thinking about this a few days ago. Like, when I'm alone, I'm an actor. But I've also written, and I continue to write, and I produce, and so part of being an actor of color, I'm 63 years old. I'm saying that so you know generationally where my point of view is coming from. So I learned early on that if you want your voice to be intact, then you have to be more than a hired actor. You have to generate your own projects, which requires producing. You have to write, which requires writing. So you got to expand your position if you want to truly have a voice in the entire creative process, or else it becomes a recurring conversation of, I wouldn't say that. We wouldn't, as people of color, say that. This kind of thing. What is or isn't racist? A conversation I've had ad infinitum with people of a different race, usually white people. So it becomes exhausting. So you gotta have to, but at the end of the day, I'm an actor. So there.
Okay. So now let's talk to Blair Underwood. Anybody know Blair Underwood? I've obviously been a fan of everyone's work. But I think, Blair, some of the things that we know about you, obviously, is that you have been nominated for every possible award. But I think maybe what some people don't know is that you actually did some spoken word work. Did anybody know it? I see you didn't know it? Okay. And in terms of some of the work that you've done, though, directing, producing, as well as acting, I think we have yet to really understand the kind of the breadth of your talent, because we're familiar with the movies that you've done, we're familiar with the television shows, LA Law and the like. I think also one of the things that's very interesting as we talk about the world and the state of the world and the climate is the work that you've done on the show Give, which I think really does a lot to illustrate kind of the global condition of everyone and what different groups of people need in order to feel of value and equal to. And so let's talk a little bit about how you would identify yourself. And you can pick personal or professional.
Well, no, it's great. The first thing David said was, how do you mean personally or professionally? Because I think it's two different things. You know, I've always seen myself personally as a black man who is an artist and director and producer and all this stuff, but as a black man who is an artist. A man of African descent who is an artist, personally. Professionally, I've always seen myself as an artist who happens to be black. For that reason, it's like David said, it's very, very similar that you're always dealing with how other people perceive you within the industry. So, you know, my career, my first 10 years was on a show called LA Law. I was that token guy for a long time. Oh, well, thank you. But I was a token many times early on in my career. I was the only person of color. There are many interracial relationships I've had in my career with Julia Roberts, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I mean many of them. I've also had relationships with black women and white women and all kinds of different, but it has been a conversation. One of those conversations I'll share with you was with Sex and the City, when they offered me this great role. Listen, this was my wife's favorite show. You know, and the offer came in and she said, "You got to do that show." I was like, I don't know, but if you watched Sex and the City, there was an episode where Kim Cattrall's character was dating a black man. And it was all about her curiosity, like, is it true what they say about black men? But it's all about...
It is.
It's true. We're just saying. For the record.
Look, y'all, it's a family show.
We didn't say what we're talking about.
We're trying to control
the
narrative.
Listen, y'all know, but my thing, what I said to them was, if it's about, because I'm dealing with your perception, if it's about the curiosity of me being a black man, I'm very honored, I'm grateful for the offer, but thank you, no. And it was 2 years later they came back around, and I ended up doing about 5 episodes and played Cynthia Nixon's love interest. And the conversation was a very similar conversation. Okay, is he gonna be the black guy? Is it about me being a black man, or am I a man? You're dealing with my humanity. They said, no, we just want you, you're a doctor that she meets in an elevator and you all fall in love. I was like, cool, then I'll do that. Now, in a different context, if I can do a deep dive into what that relationship is really like, deal with the complexities and the nuances of an interracial relationship, then I'm open to have that conversation. But if I'm dealing with these writers who just, you know, like you said, you have to be like, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't do that. I'd rather take that off the table, and I've done that many times in my career. Let me just be the man, the guy, and if not, thank you, another actor will take the role. I'm grateful, I'll just go do something else.
Okay, all right. Okay, Angela Kang, like that was deep, wasn't it? Okay. Angela Kang, absolutely incredible writer, co-EP, co-executive producer, and now showrunner on one of our favorite television shows, The Walking Dead. Anyone familiar? Yes. So Also, Angela has been recognized, in particular in 2016, as a talent to watch in Hollywood. So that's an incredible thing. But what I think is today, in particular, really special about your background and sort of your worldview has to do with the fact that you actually grew up in the entertainment business. You started as an intern. And you were able to see so much success along the way to the point where now you're really kind of the storyteller and the thinker and the driver behind this iconic show. So we thank you. We welcome you and tell us how you identify yourself.
You know, I think obviously that the two superficial things that you see on me that I can't escape are I'm a woman and I'm Asian American, and so that's very much a part of my identity. I think, I also, a lot of my background has to do with growing up as the child of immigrants. That really shapes a lot of my worldview and experience in the world as well. And my father's a machinist, so I come from a blue-collar family. And so I think in Hollywood, sometimes these things are sort of unusual. There are a lot of people who, especially on the writing side, have grown up from, upper middle class families, rich families, sometimes, generations of people in the entertainment business. And I now write for a show where there's such a diversity of viewpoints and people involved. And so these sort of experiences are helpful in terms of forming these stories. But, I think similarly to what David and Blair are talking about, when I'm just thinking of myself as an artist, I'm an artist and I happen to have these backgrounds, but I think of myself as a creative person first and foremost. It's somebody who always loved telling stories and making things up and having done that from childhood. So I think sometimes it's I've got my inner perception of myself, but it's also what people are going to see when they think of me and when they look at me and when they see me on a panel or when I go in for a meeting. Those are things that I'm proud of those aspects of my identity, but I think it's when I'm living inside my own skin, I'm just a creator.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Elizabeth Vargas. So happy to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. So many of you may be aware of some of her more recent accolades as a co-anchor on 2020. I think what's really exciting about some of the thinking that you can lend to this conversation is the fact that you have traveled around the world and you've met so many different people from so many different walks of life. So I'm sure that has just been very enriching. You have certainly been recognized and highly acclaimed as a journalist for many years on both NBC and ABC. And so we're excited to have you here. Please tell us how you identify yourself.
As a woman, I'm a Latina. My grandfather is from Puerto Rico, and my dad was first generation, very similar in that it came from my grandfather was an electrician who moved to New Jersey from Puerto Rico as an adult, and to the day he died at age 93, spoke barely, so broken English. And my dad was the first person in his family to graduate from high school, to learn to drive a car, to go to college, all while working 3 jobs, and joined the military and got his master's degree courtesy of the US military. And I'm an Army brat. That's another way I identify myself. And you're right, I've gotten to travel all over the world and meet all sorts of people. And it's interesting, depending on where you go, those facets of how we identify themselves take a step forward. In some parts of the Middle East, because I'm a woman, felt very, very obvious, because in many cases, I would have to hide, either wear a headscarf or act a certain way. You can see, even in Japan, in Tokyo, when I was there once, that women aren't supposed to act this way. So it's interesting how different parts of ourselves step forward and come forward. Throughout my career, especially in local news, I would get a lot of Hispanic and Latin groups saying, why don't you just cover, stories about, Hispanics? And my attitude was always, I should be the best reporter in the newsroom, not the best Hispanic reporter in the newsroom. And felt that was the best way to sort of move mainstream and in the media, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this, the importance of people turning on the news and seeing people in positions of authority or telling stories who look and sound like them, who have last names like them, is incredibly important.
Yeah, it's very empowering. Thank you for that. Brandon Michael Hall, hello.
Hello.
So we're excited to have Brandon here. He may be familiar to many of us based on his work on the television show The Mayor. Anybody familiar with The Mayor? Good stuff, right? And more recently, on the television series God Friended Me. Like, you can't do no better than God friending you, right? That's it. That's the pinnacle. Talk to us a little bit about how you identify yourself.
I identify myself first and foremost, yes, as a black man in this industry. But also with that, I identify myself as a child of the art. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. Acting has always been a thing for me that brought me closure, brought me some type of therapeutic, outlook on life. It was fun, always has been, and I want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
And I know that there are other things and other attributes and other skill sets that I have, and that acting was the door to walk into those different places. So for me, I consider myself an entrepreneur at first, and that art is just something that it keeps a smile on my face. So I never want it to be work. I never want acting to just be a job for me. The moment that it starts being work, there's no use in doing it for me. But there are so many other avenues and so many other platforms that I'm interested in and that I want to speak up and be a part of. And to know that acting was the gateway to get in that is perfect for me.
So while we're there with you, let's move into the next part of our conversation. So talking a little bit about your background and how you came into acting. You studied at Juilliard. You are the son of a single mother.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's hear for single moms.
Already.
That's right. So Juilliard. Talk a little bit about coming from South Carolina and that experience. And when we talk about diversity, there are the regional aspects to that as well, right?
Culture shock.
Yeah.
That was a culture shock getting off the bus. I took the Chinatown bus from, anybody else? $30 to get up here, back and forth? I took the Chinatown bus coming up this way, and I literally got off on Canal Street, and I was like, what the flip is this? It's crazy town.
Did you say flip? Did you
no,
say
I
that?
definitely didn't, but this is being live recorded.
Okay, honoring the family.
So I can't use everything. CBS got me synthesized. But then when I went to 66 in Lincoln Center, that was another culture shock. And I didn't come from poverty or anything like that. My mom maintained everything in our household. She made sure that we never went without anything. She struggled, but that struggle was beautiful on the other side because I am a product of her struggle, you feel me? So when I came to 66 in Lincoln Center, I was like, oh, this is money. This is different. And what Juilliard did for me was, once again, it gave, after coming out, the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities was the first place that I went before, and that was my first step to getting into Juilliard. And like Blair was saying, Mr. Underwood, I apologize. We were just chopping it up backstage. I was like, But like he was saying, like I've always been the token as well. Even when I was at the governor's school, I was the only black guy in my class. When I was at Juilliard, I was the only black guy in my class. On God Friend to Me, I'm the only black guy. But other than Joe. But it was a moment where I had to look outside of myself for really the first time and see myself as, yes, I am a black man. And yes, I am a man in this industry where that is not really accepted, or those stories aren't being told as much as they are now. We never did an August Wilson play, like I was saying back. Like, I had to do Our Town, you know?
Okay.
Thornton Wilder. But that I knew that through this art, through acting, there was a universal code that I had to crack. And that was the only way I was going to continue to thrive outside of Juilliard. And so I started to read a lot. You know, I started to read more plays. I started to read about other cultures, other artists who were doing the same kind of work that I was passionate about doing. And that's what Juilliard started to cultivate for me, was that no matter who you are in that school, at the end of the day, if you're not getting the job done, it doesn't matter. I have to get this job done. I have to tell these stories of people who don't have the opportunity to tell their own stories. So that's what Juilliard put in perspective for me. Yeah.
Okay, so let's stay on that for a minute. So, David.
Yes.
You graduated from Yale School of Drama. Trained Shakespearean.
Yeah.
It's huge. Talk a little bit about kind of the journey that you made, as you know, and when we're talking about as a creative person, as a storyteller, and how your identity, your personal identity, informed sort of how you experienced your life after school and moving into the industry further and further.
Okay, one of the reasons I went to Yale Drama School was because, you know, at that time, so 78 to 81, that's when I attended Yale, it was all about conservatory training. I mean, Meryl Streep, these actors that I really respected went to these institutions. So one of my goals personally was I never wanted to walk into an audition and have the casting people say, he's not qualified, he's not trained. So I very purposely chose Yale, and I was lucky enough to get in because I wanted to eliminate that. Now, something really interesting happened. After my first year, I came out to Los Angeles to hang out and do some work. And I went to a casting director, this white woman, 30-something, and I remember she told me, she said, the first thing I'll have to overcome after I graduate is not to intimidate those who are attempting to cast me. Wow. Because she told me that because I'm a black man who graduated from the Yale Drama School, I'm going to be more educated than 99% of these knuckleheads that are casting you. So I was very grateful for her to tell me that, because first of all, she was speaking the truth.
Yeah.
And I was glad to hear it. But when I received it, it was perplexing because as every person on the stage who is of color, then you're met with this quandary. Well, I'm trying to get the best training, resume, education I can, yet when I do that, you're saying, well, you're too intimidating. So what do I do now? Okay. Also, I wanted to do Shakespeare and Chekhov and all these things that I didn't necessarily see actors of color doing regularly, but I really wanted to tackle that and be fluent in that and try and conquer that and be successful in that. My heroes, the actors I looked up to were like James Earl Jones, who has a career both in the classics and film and stage. I mean, that kind of actor, Brock Peters, all these guys that I grew up, Sidney Poitier. I remember reading Sidney Poitier's This Life, and I was going, well, if he did this in 1950,
right? Right.
I should be able to do something.
Yep.
You know, and so I wanted so much to be an artist. And I say that, of course I'm a black artist.
Yes.
And that is who I am. I can't change that. And I just wanted to be in this community. And so that was my goal. I forgot the question.
This lady.
Sorry.
And you know what? The question don't even matter, because that was amazing. Yeah, it's great to hear that story. Okay, so now we're talking about the stories and experiences that are portrayed. So Angela, I want to move over to you. When we're talking about storytelling, you and I had this very interesting conversation about all of the different sort of dimensions of diversity that are represented in the work that you've been doing on your show. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't know if everyone is clear on that. I certainly wasn't. And then what went into the decision to go there intentionally?
It's been really great working on The Walking Dead, and I've worked there since almost the beginning of the series, since the 7th episode on. And for many years, it's been an incredibly diverse cast. We've also had, great diversity in the writers' room as well. And it started in a lot of ways with the comic book itself. I think our creator, Robert Kirkman, created a comic book that showcases people from many different backgrounds coming together because, in a zombie apocalypse, it's all of a sudden there's this other enemy, and so the tribalism that humans kind of get into, it's like, well, when there's these monsters, like maybe those of us that are left should band together, regardless of where we came from.
And survival will do that to you.
Survival will do that to you. And we've been able to show that some characters who maybe came from backgrounds where, where there were some kind of, racist backgrounds and things like that can perhaps evolve over time or see different viewpoints. And as time has gone on and our people have met more people, we have, diversity of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, of age, of nationality, of ability, of, it's like we hit all these different things. And it's also like we have a lot of cases where it's like there's a lot of shows where there's the token. That's very common. And we have a lot of they're not the only one, it's not like just one person of color from a particular race. It's not just one LGBTQ character. We have multiple people because that feels like that's representative of the world that we live in America. But it's also, this is a show that plays globally, and it has connected with audiences globally. And I think the diversity is probably an aspect of it. I think there's an aspect, of course, that has to do with the underlying material, which is people can find something to hold on to about survival, and that can kind of cross many different barriers of language or culture. But there've been studies done that show that diverse stories tend to play well around the world, and we've certainly seen that with a lot of movies that have broken out. A lot of TV shows that play well around the world do show people from a lot of different backgrounds. We have diversity of religion, things like that. So that's been, for me, definitely very just gratifying to work on, and even for writers in the room, this year, it's, I have a writer who works for me who's an Asian American woman. She's like, I've never been in a room with another Asian American writer. I had 2 black writers, and they're like, I've never been in a room with another black writer. It's like that happens, but it's, having that diversity of viewpoints is really, it only helps our storytelling. We go into it to try to tell a great story that's entertaining, and having people who are from different walks of life just lets us enrich the material, I think, And so we go there because it allows us to tell a good story. We go there not just because it's kind of like the right thing to do, I think, but it's also, it gives us so many avenues of storytelling. We introduced a couple of deaf characters into the show who are also African American. And it's like we haven't told that kind of story before. But we're also learning too, because we're like, okay, we're learning so many things about deaf culture that we didn't know. And like I've actually found myself on the other side of the conversation of like, my character wouldn't do that. Like as a deaf, like as a deaf actor, like this is an area of sensitivity. It's like, oh my God, like, yeah, I got to do better. Like, those are the conversations we have to have. But as we learn more about each other, I think it just makes us stronger as artists and stronger as people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I love about, again, this study and all of the richness around the content that helps us to remember that the importance of really expanding our own minds so that we can be equal to participate in these richer stories and richer relationships. So thank you for that. I love the work that you're doing, and I think everybody, if you haven't checked the show out, you need to. So now, Elizabeth, while we're talking about stories, so the media as a storyteller, well. So that's, I think there's just kind of so much going on right now in the media. And again, what I love is that you've really had a front row seat to both watching the way that the media is portraying people from diverse backgrounds and kind of serving up stories that can influence thinking. Talk a little bit about, what your point of view is in terms of how the media is portraying people from different backgrounds and social or ethnic or cultural groups.
Well, I think it's incumbent on those of us as journalists to try and go deeper and not be so superficial. Mm-hmm. But listen, when it comes to diversity, first of all, it's incredibly important because millions of Americans watch the news, and it's incumbent on us to tell the news from all different perspectives and points of view. And there's been enormous progress that's been made. You see more people of color in front of the camera, for example. You see more women in front of the camera, but it's still far from done. We still see the majority of the people in front of television cameras, whether they be anchors or experts, are white men. Yeah. And this is partly a product of the fact that the vast majority of the people who are making the decisions about what to cover and how to cover it are white men, because that's where the real power is. I mean, you were talking about the writer's room and how important that is to have people of color writing the stories. It's important to have people of color in different perspectives saying, this is what we're going to cover, because I don't get to say, okay, I'm going to go do this story and book these crews and interview this person. I've got to go through a whole approval process, and it's a collaborative process. And there are very few anchors who have the power to say, I'm going to book this person. I don't care what management thinks. I can think of one right now, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, seriously, who bucked her own bosses and booked Ronan Farrow on her show after Ronan Farrow had written a book saying her bosses had, basically buckled under and not reported the Harvey Weinstein story when he had it. Right. So, there was an example several years ago when we were having a lot of upheaval in this country over police violence toward young black men. And we were doing at ABC a town hall with President Obama at the time, who was president at the time, a live town hall. And there was, this is a major production, all hands on deck. And there was a conference room where people were all planning how we're going to cover this. And it was glass enclosed, as many of these things are in many offices. And somebody walked by and noticed that every single person in there was white. Now, we're doing a town hall meeting with the nation's first black president about the epidemic of violence against black men by police officers. Where are the black people? And thank God somebody noticed the optics of that at the very least and decided to, diversify. The brain the place, the room where it was happening, to quote, Lin-Manuel Miranda on Hamilton. The room where it's happening needs to have more women, needs to have more people of color.
Right.
Because it has a dramatic impact on how the news covers these stories. And how we cover these stories makes a huge difference in how people think. And that includes, those Sunday morning talk shows or those panels of experts that we have. There was a time years and years ago when they were all white men. And I remember it was, there was a concerted effort on behalf of ABC News to diversify our panels. Now, it's easy to pick up the phone and call John Meacham, or whoever, who's a fantastic guest and who is really brilliant and really, really smart. It's harder to go out and find the woman, or the black, or the Latino, or the Asian, American, somebody else to come in. And you now see many more times. I mean, I turn on This Week with George Stephanopoulos sometimes, and he'll have 4 women on as the experts, and it's about time we did that.
Yeah.
But we have to continue to do that. It's like turning the Titanic.
Yeah.
It's a long, slow process, and you can't let up.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So now let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about representation, but in the study we talk a lot about the influence that brands have when we're talking about diversity to help the entire world see things differently. And we've had some great, great advertisers tell interesting stories that are important in culture. Blair, I'd like to ask you about your own personal experiences with people that are different, and how that informs the way in which you view your own responsibility as an actor when you're thinking about bringing a character to life, when you're thinking about roles to take and the opportunities there. Because one of the things that we know is that celebrities are now brands as well, right? I say Blair Underwood, everybody. And it's important too. Big brands, big brands. But so, thinking about it through that lens, the people around you, the experiences that you've had with people that may not be from the same background, how does that inform the way that you move through the world and the decisions that you make?
Oh, it's huge. It's about interaction. It's about knowing each other. At the end of the day, it's about being exposed to each other. We hate because we don't know. We don't know often because we fear. So it's important that we connect, that we interconnect, we get to know each other. My father is a retired Army brat. I'm an Army brat too, like Elizabeth, a retired Army colonel. So I grew up on Army bases all over the world. And when I was in junior high school for my 7th and 8th grade year, I was the only black kid in the school. Then we moved to Petersburg, Virginia, so 9th through 12th, it was a 98% black school. Prior to Michigan, 6th and 7th in elementary, it was like half and half in Alexandria, Virginia. So all my life, I'm so grateful to have had that perspective of different communities and different cultures. So that's why I always go back to, personally in the work I try to choose, I go back to the common denominator, which is our humanity.
Yeah.
But once we build upon that and go deeper and go higher than that, they're dimensions of our humanity. They're the specificity of who we are, our race, our culture, our color. That's where it gets fun to play with that. But we have to be represented. We have to see ourselves initially, and then see other people and start to understand. So I think that's where it begins. And to answer your question, my stance as an artist today is greatly informed by that kid who grew up in those different communities. Because when I was that only black kid in school, my 7th and 8th grade year in junior high school, all of my friends were white.
Yeah.
And to hear their perspective from their parents, it's like, well, we've never met a black person. This was in Warren, Michigan at the time, 12 miles outside Detroit. We've never met a black person. So their only identity, their only understanding of black culture was at that time the Jeffersons and the Good Times. And Good Times. Come on, brother. So it was all, just broad comedy. Or the evening news. When oftentimes, because of choices that are made, we'll focus on this guy who's getting arrested, this black guy who's getting arrested. We'll focus on maybe the most inarticulate people in the community to kind of show a different skew of the community.
Yeah.
So that's what I came out of. So when I became an actor, and had a chance to decide what I want to do and understand, which is another conversation, but that you have the power to say no. You don't have to take any job.
Right.
That's a whole nother conversation. That's, a faith in a higher power, that I'm not beholden to this studio executive or this network executive or my agent. It's okay if you say no, because something else will come along. It's okay. So I've tried to exercise that throughout my life, but it really is about making sure we see each other. And we can't see each other unless somebody's in those rooms making those decisions to cast and hire different people of different races. Now, Janet mentioned that there have been many reports about diversity and how, yes, it's economically sound because you can speak to a global community because people want to see themselves represented. So it's not a mystery. Shonda Rhimes has done an amazing job with Scandal, How to Get Away with Murder. All of her shows are incredibly diverse. It's very smart, it's very wise, but also it's educational and entertainment at the same time.
Now, you hit on an important topic, which is really about us seeing each other.
Yeah.
Right? So, we've got a pretty polarizing subject here, right? And just so you know, I'm going off the script. Everybody hold on. But when we talk about taking those conversations and interactions with each other to a place where we can feel comfortable enough to share ourselves, right, in a way that would allow someone different from me to see me and vice versa, we're having a time with it right now. So I would ask you, and just open this up to everyone, well, how do we help people that are different from us feel safe enough? Now it's going to get fun. But feel safe enough to just begin to ask those questions. I think there are a lot of people that would like to know more about people that are different, but I think we're at it in a time and place where it's like, whoa, can I ask that? Can I say that? Maybe not. I'll just sit here. I'll be quiet where it's safe. So if there was one suggestion that we could give everybody in terms of how to do that, how do you start? What can you say to say, hey, it's come and talk to me. Don't be scared because I'm the black woman in the room. If you want to know more, come and talk to me about it. What's some advice? What can
Don't start the conversation on Twitter. I'm telling you the truth.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, my reaction to this whole area is I feel like, as a black man, I have spent an inordinate amount of time in my life explaining to those individuals of other races that it's okay. I'm all right. I'm the same as you. I'll tell you a quick story, the absurdity of racism. I was in Laguna Beach, California, years ago, and it was dusk, and I was crossing the street, Pacific Coast Highway. And as the light changed, there was an elderly white couple that pulled up, and I was about to jog to try and make the light, and they instinctively pressed the locks on their doors. As they drove off, I just burst out, "It's okay, I'm on TV!" And I realized their action was ridiculous. My response was ridiculous. But here we are. I was basically saying, I'm not like all of them. I'm an actor. No. So, I don't know. You should, but it's hard to have those honest discussions, especially now because everything is social media. My white friend just asked me what, cancel. But if it's, I don't know, if it's done in a loving and interested, open way, then I feel like you should be able to have those conversations, Maybe not on Twitter, though, or Instagram.
Yeah. What do you think, Blair?
I agree with that. What he said. No. No, it's got to start with that. But I tell you, it's why I love what we do as actors and entertainers and storytellers, because so often you can bridge that gap by saying, go see this movie. Go
wait.
go understand this.
Don't you think diversity does that? You understand? So if you grow up in or experience a diverse educational system, then we're not pressed to have that one, what is it like to be a trans person conversation? Because we have grown up or gone to school with, I see this different person at work who conducts his or her or their self just the same as me. They want the same space as me. So that is the best way to eliminate the need for those conversations, is a diverse atmosphere. So that would be my number one advocacy towards a more diverse workplace in society.
Angela, what do you think about that?
I don't know if this is exactly advice. I'll just mention something that I think is pretty rampant in Hollywood, but it seems like on the basis of some of the slides that were shown earlier that this is just, it's part of the deal. I think that, as there's conversations about diversity and really trying to diversify workplaces or diversify what you see on screen, et cetera, I think that there can be a pervasive feeling amongst some folks that it's like, well, that's taking away from my opportunity or my child's opportunity. Like, I've literally had conversations about this week. There's a scarcity mindset. It's like, what about my white male child? Like, is he gonna have the opportunities? Is it being taken away by women and minorities? And sometimes the way that those statements or questions are framed, there is an implicit bias there, which is as if to say, like, shouldn't it all be based on merit, rather than it being like all about women and minorities? And it's like, okay, but what's the assumption there? There is an implicit assumption that the women and minorities are getting in by way of quota rather than through merit. Whereas, like, I can't speak for everybody on this panel, but if I had to guess, it's a similar experience. As a woman and a minority, I feel like I have to be better than anybody who's at my level to prove that I deserve to be there. And that's always been the case. When I was a staff writer, I got in through what they call a diversity slot for a network thing, but my resume, my writing, was exceptional. It was above and beyond what the normal person who has one of those entry-level jobs has. And so I think it's, I think if people of color or, people from, underrepresented groups sense that somebody is coming at a conversation with an agenda, with this sort of scarcity mindset, I think most of us will probably code switch into like a kind of like a, it's okay thing. You can't have the real conversation. So I think it's like, but I think intention can be sensed. If somebody comes at something with good intention and feels like an ally or somebody who really wants to talk about something honestly, then I think, the majority of people, again, I can't speak for everybody in every situation, but it's like you can feel the good intention there and you can have a more honest conversation like friends or like colleagues do. So that's, I don't know, that's just my sense of it.
Yeah, so you hit on some terminology that I think we need to give a minute to, code switching. Is there anyone not familiar with code switching?
Somebody's lying.
Okay. So
he put his hand up right there.
Yeah, I got a couple. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Now they giving it up.
Yes. There's unity in the group.
Yeah, me too.
Would you speak a little bit to code switching? And in the study, we talk about covering. So I'd like you to just speak to code switching, and then I want to talk about, I want to find out if anyone has ever felt they needed to cover some aspect of their identity in order to, either get ahead or be seen or feel that they were a part of, the work product or something.
I think code switching is, it's a term. It basically means covering. But it really refers to the fact that in different situations with different people, you're showing different aspects of yourself, and it's still all you, but it's like maybe amongst your family, you are one way, maybe amongst your work colleagues you're another way, with people of the same race you might be one way, with people of a different race you might be another way. So it applies to really everybody, but it's certainly amongst people of color, we often feel that we might need to do it more. But I'm code switching now because I'm here in front of what I think is mostly a corporate audience, and I talk like a sailor most of the time. So, so I'm being very careful to be on grandma's house language.
Yeah, that is. Now, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I was thinking about this. Like the real basic code switching is just everything you said was all about projecting ourselves as I'm not a threat.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. Adopting language and behavior in which you are communicating, you don't have to worry about me. And as black men, that's something we do constantly. Because if you're on an elevator, with one of a white lady or something, it's okay. I'm not a threat. So we can move forward. I'm not here to get you, whether it's corporate, or out in the public. That's what I feel it is.
Mm-hmm. Now, Elizabeth, have you ever felt that you needed to cover any aspect of your identity at work?
Not really, mostly because it's not easy to cover up that I'm a woman and I'm, my last name, and I'm dark, so I'm Hispanic. And it's been something I've been proud of. So. But to the point that you were making previously, the reason people code switch is because other people, they fear other people will fear them. And right now we are in a climate of unprecedented fear and unprecedented division, in my opinion. And a lot of it is fed by the belief, which is incorrect, that somebody else, if you get something or win something or get a job, get promoted, get citizenship, get health insurance, whatever, it's going to come at my expense. Mm-hmm. And we have to break out of that, and that's a difficult thing to do. But the best and most effective way to do it is to humanize the other. Whether that's done by watching your favorite television show or going to the movie theater and seeing a movie, or if it's done by watching news programs and seeing people who you think are the other, are actually smart and empathetic, and you learn something and they're humanized therefore in your eyes, that's the way you break down barriers. But we have to get past that. And by the way, it exists even within business cultures. Mm-hmm. Television news is a brutally competitive business that is especially hard on women. We are not allowed to age on television. You have avuncular, anchormen who are 80 years old still reading teleprompters, and women are ushered out the door in their mid-40s. I mean, it is an absolute reality. It's in Hollywood as well. Actresses who are incredibly gifted and talented have a hard time finding meaty roles past a certain age, which is, horrifically young. And I think that, and within television news, there is that whole, if she gets this promotion or gets this assignment, it's at my expense because, there's only so many to go around. Right. And it can be really insidious and can lead to people never working together and seeing other people as friends and colleagues and supporters and cheerleaders and being that for that other person. And only as a competitor. Your progress comes at my my peril.
Yeah. So we've got two more things I wanted to cover. Brandon, so we're on a panel with people from different age groups. And you're the millennial. Yay, you.
Whoa, whoa.
Yes, yes.
We won't hold it against you.
I take it.
That's your cue to say go boomer.
Go boomers.
So talk a little bit about, kind of the lens through which you are not only viewing the industry that you've chosen to work in, but also your own experiences. Because we've heard a lot of very interesting points of view from young people. I think we had, a 16-year-old that said, everyone should feel included. Don't be stupid. But that's not the way the world is working. But what are you seeing as a young black man in Hollywood kind of coming into your own?
I'm seeing that that things haven't really evolved. It's more so that the language has changed, right? That's what Byron Allen is fighting for right now at Comcast, right? Is that we've looked back and we've seen the effects of what old language can do, and now we're presented in a new age and it doesn't work. So what do? We fight it. You get people involved who are feeling the exact same way, and you bring it to the attention of the nation. You put it on YouTube, you put it on Twitter, you put it on Instagram and Facebook, and you get people involved. Because we're living in a society right now where we have access to everything. So listening to the questions, for me, it's very much, what is the purpose of code switching now when I can literally just make a video and say what I want to say? You're not going to do anything about it. They can take it down, but I don't have to code switch now. The problem is education. The problem is that growing up in the South, having a textbook, a history textbook, and having certain pages ripped out that I can't go home and study. The problem is that when I'm looking at those textbooks, I see the slavery documents, I see Jim Crow, I see when what's the other one? Help me out. There's a lot going on up there talking here. Reconstruction, thank you. But these are the things that I see. And then you see a big picture of Barack Obama in the back. Maybe he might be small at the bottom. But that's the problem, is education, but then they want to take the funding away from education. They want to take the funding away from the arts. That is supposed to bind the two together. So my whole philosophy right now is that we're in a time right now where everything is happening so fast that we're forgetting to take a moment and realize that, wait, we've skipped some steps. The reason why we have to code switch, the reason why people feel like they have to go in survival mode is, once again, what everyone was saying. We don't know each other. How do you live in a society, how do you live in New York City and still feel alone? That doesn't make any sense to me. How can I be on Instagram for 4, 5, 6, 10 hours a day? You can check your iPhone, it'll tell you. And still feel like I'm not connected to someone. How is that possible? Because we're not educated, but we have everything to teach us right here. Why are we not taking out the time to do it? That's where I think we are now. And I'm not speaking for every millennial, the boomers. I'm not speaking for everyone, but it really baffles me, because I find myself in those positions too, where I'll say, hey, I wonder what happened in this time period. Or like, man, the Black Wall Street, man, that was a thing. I can look it up. I can go tell my friend about it. Hey, I know you voted for Trump, but did you know there was a Black Wall Street at some point? Let's sit down and talk about it. Let's have a conversation about it, Like, how come I didn't know that Central Park was once a black community? Why haven't we told those stories? It doesn't make any sense to me when we live in a society where you have 4K video to make it yourself. We didn't have that then. You can do it now. So I think it's just pure ignorance. I think it's just us on ourselves being like, we can just relate to how we used to talk about diversity, how we used to talk about these things. The problem is now is that we can actually do something about it. Byron Allen is a pure example of that. He is fighting the amendment. He wants to change the amendment. It's in the words. If we don't educate ourselves about what happened years ago, that they knew was going to prosper now, and looking at the way the society is now, how separated we are in a world we're supposed to be so connected, how important this next election is, that we literally are living in a time where our president is going through an impeachment. This is terrifying. So when someone comes up to me and they say, hey, how are you doing? I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to tell you that I'm okay, because I'm not. I saw a video today of a guy who had no limbs. He had no limbs. And there was a cop who was wrestling him to the ground. What does that say about us? South Carolina, a man was ran away and shot in the back. Confederate state. I love my state. I love South Carolina. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And if you're from there, you get it. But you also get the other side. You don't forget that. I don't forget walking across a CVS at 2 a.m. 2 weeks before I was supposed to go to the governor's school and getting stopped and profiled. I don't forget those things. Yeah. So for me right now, as a millennial, as an artist, I'm really shocked. I wake up every day and I'm so blessed to be able to do God Friended Me, where we're talking about a black atheist. That's a story that's never been told. You know, we're bringing in trans pastors and reverends, you know. Why don't we take the opportunity to go to those churches? Mm-hmm. I live on a street where there are 3 churches. Malcolm X said the most segregated time in all America is high noon on Sunday. But y'all can all meet at the restaurant afterwards, but we can't sit down and talk about the thing that's supposed to bring us hope.
Yeah.
So I can't say that I'm okay. I can't, because it's not.
Well, I think you, yes. So I think you bring up a really important point. We talk about, you know, language and really the state in which we are not having moved at all in so many years. Now, I want to turn to David, you and Blair, because you are doing a Soldier's Play that's opening in late December, early January. I think it really speaks to this topic on even a deeper level when we're talking about how things were. And when we're talking about the complexity of diversity, not just now from this global view, but in our own community. Talk a little bit, talk a little bit about that and your character there.
Well, you know, when I saw the play in the early 80s, one of the things I really loved about this piece that Charles Fuller wrote was it's really an interracial conversation and situation in terms of these African American men and how they perceive the right way to fight and address racism. Especially at that time, it was really rare. You usually have one black character who's, you know, the orator for the entire race. So it was a luxury to see all these black voices on stage talking in and amongst themselves, coming at it from different political and personal points of view, who's right and who's wrong. You're really left to choose who you most align yourself with. My character, I play the sergeant, I don't know how I guess you'd call him a black nationalist. Maybe if Sergeant Waters were alive today, he'd probably be Republican. I don't know. I mean, he has very extreme attitudes. Blair's character is totally the polar opposite, you know, and that's really what it's about. We mix all that up. You could have the conversation right now today. Right now today, I mean, it could be happening right in this situation. You know, a murder's committed, you come into the play and you assume the most obvious. And it's all around racism and cultural bias.
And now talk a little bit about your character, Blair, and some of the bias that takes shape in the play.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say it's amazing because David has a long history with the play, A Soldier's Play. He also did the movie The Soldier's Story, starring David Allen Greer and Denzel Washington, Howard Rollins, and yeah. So that's good. We haven't had a chance to download on that. That's got to be an amazing full circle moment how to play Sergeant Waters. But yeah, my character, Captain Davenport, investigates this murder. If you're not familiar with the story, 1944, Louisiana Army base, and there's a murder that takes place. It's an all-black unit. And my character he is a lawyer by trade, but he's tasked with investigating, and he's also an MP because there's not much for lawyers to do in the segregated armed services. But you know, for me, the play speaks to what I love about it is it just gets under the layers and uncovers just self-love, self-hatred, and everything in between. And to have all these different perspectives, mostly black, but also white perspectives. This play was written, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1981. But like David was saying, it's as relevant, in some ways more relevant today than it was when it first came out.
I just want to add, there's a scene where Blair comes in. He really runs the interrogation to try and get to the bottom of this murder. And one of the black troops comes and turns. When they first meet him, he's a black officer, and this black enlisted man has never seen an officer of color before. And I just love that moment where his character has to say, what's the problem? He's like, I've never seen you like that. I've never seen myself in this role, you understand? So he has to put him at ease, and then they continue on. It deals with all that stuff. It's good.
Well, thank you for bringing that to the screen. I think we need to wrap up now. But I did want to say that it is incredible how all of these really tough issues that keep us separate are still as relevant today as they were in the 40s, as they were in the 20s. And I think our study goes a long way to help people begin to broaden their minds. I would encourage everyone to go and see this play, because I think it will help, and it really doesn't matter your background, it will help you continue to elevate your own consciousness and hopefully expose yourself to different experiences that you hadn't thought about, that will help all of us to see each other a little bit better and to hopefully feel empowered to work harder, so that we don't have millennials who feel like they are not okay, because that is not okay. So with that, we're going to say thank all of you for your time. Thank you so much. Incredible comments.
Thank you again to, I got to say out loud, an incredible panel. We do a lot of these, and wow, so many thoughts. I will not keep you very long. I just want to summarize with a couple of things. We started the morning by saying that this is about conversations, not answers. And I think, and about questioning. And I think we've had some incredible conversations and incredible questioning along the way. For me, some highlights, just for what it's worth. You know, really figuring out how to understand the deeper cultural roots of why attitudes and behaviors and beliefs happen and why they occur today is incredibly important. And I think that's a huge takeout from today, from the globality of diversity, from race to gender to religious beliefs, to origins, to coexistence of ideas. I mean, such a diversity of diversity, if I can say that out loud. That's incredible for us to really embrace and understand, because it's not just how people look, it's about where they come from. It's about the systems that created them. And until we inject diversity into those systems, and I think that's what the panel did a beautiful job talking about, we don't change the system that we live in. So how we infect in a beautiful way things like education systems, government systems, for those of us that get the honor of working with many brands that are global, 60 countries, 100 countries, how we infect in a good way through the works that we do on those brands, through what we portray, through what we create, through how we innovate. It's all up to all of us. And I took that away from today's findings. You know, again, a fact-based understanding of where diversity is today from our Truth About Diversity, as well as this panel conversation. And just really understanding the influence that we all have, frankly. You know, I thought it was incredible to just hear about the common, I think Blair called it the common denominator, humanity. That's pretty amazing. You know, if we all really bond together and use that for the power for good, it can be kind of incredible. So a couple of little parting thoughts. What next? Because I think we've opened Pandora's box here by having a lot of rich conversations today. You know, we've got a lot more. We've just scratched the surface. If you like what you've seen, if some of the data speaks to you, if you want to use it to help with your own endeavors, we have many different studies. We have now about 25 million data points across the world to help us understand different pieces and unpack a lot of these things, whether it's female empowerment, whether it's, you know, really understanding the different sort of areas that we have. There's lots of different studies that we can bring forward and help you with. And the studies aren't just pieces of paper that we then put on a shelf. We actually use them. We use them in our day-to-day work with our brands. We use them in our day-to-day work with a lot of our clients and with ourselves as well. Because a lot of this fact-based understanding can help us in two ways. It can help us with the workplace and the conditions that we hope to set up to create consciously inclusive workplaces. And it can help us in the marketplace with the images we portray, with the things that we create, with the things that we actually put out into culture that give us the opportunity to change, again, the narrative and change these systems that we've talked about. So when it comes to the marketplace, you know, I think when India talked us through this piece right here, which talks about the different behaviors and the different ways to manifest diversity and inclusion, whether it's being, just ticking the boxes, or all the way up through doing things that are seismically changing what people believe and how they exist together. Really thinking about that as our brands and for ourselves as companies, where are we on this, and having a truthful, honest look at that. Are we just ticking the boxes? Are we using the language that the panel brought up? Or are we actually sparking action? Are we actually doing things that are very different and changing things? We have a whole area that helps us actually unpack that. India and Laura both mentioned. At McCann World Group, we are obsessed with helping our clients' brands play a meaningful role in people's lives. And that meaningful role comes from everything that our clients make, all the way up through the causes that they associate themselves with and the things that they take a stand on. And we'll continue to help them with that. We have a whole tool set that helps us do that. We call it cultural leadership. So as we partner with our brands, we try to figure out very, very deeply what is the thing that they can actually champion. How can they change the culture? Because I think this entire morning was about injecting the culture with new conversations and new behaviors and attitudes as well. Within the workplace, it's a very important thing because that's where it starts. So within our companies, within our structures, within our systems that we all work within, if we really think about how we can create those conditions, if you will, where conscious inclusion occurs, where everybody from every walk of life is actually welcome, where their ideas can be heard, where they can be seen. Again, we heard that a lot from the panel today. Changing the room where it happens. I loved that from Elizabeth Vargas, of just making sure the room where it's happening is actually diverse in the first place. We, in fact, just took a journey as a company, and we have about 20,000 people around the world, and we shut down for a day. And we said, what would it mean, and how would we get to a place where we've changed the room where it's happening, where we've actually created those conditions where conscious inclusion can happen in all of our offices around the world. And it was incredibly meaningful for our teams, and we're still going through all the data and all the ideas. So we'll be happy to share some of those ideas with you as well. So net, just thank you for the morning. I'm inspired. My head is kind of filled with all sorts of ideas and actions and behaviors. And thank you again to our entire team for pulling this off. It's amazing. And our partnership with the Paley Center, without which we couldn't do these incredible events where we bring some provocative conversation to bear and then figure out what we can do with it as a team and as a world at large to actually move it forward. So thanks very much.